World leaders have condemned the violent protests that have unfolded in Brazil as an assault on democracy. Thousands of people in that country stormed the presidential palace, the Congress and the Supreme Court at the weekend. They refused to accept the results of last year's election, which saw the defeat of former President Jair Bolsonaro. Incumbent President Lula da Silva has called for calm while protesters demand his resignation. So let's make sense of all these developments for you now, bringing Dr. Dorothee Boulanger, who's a research fellow at Oxford University, live to us from Oxford today. Doc, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much indeed for making time to speak to us. You know, often we're told that there are warning signs before you see the kind of violence that unfolded in Brazil. I wonder whether you were taken aback when you saw those visuals of just how grotesque the attack on these institutions actually was.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me. Well, I think we can say that it's a shock, but it wasn't entirely a surprise. First, because, as many commentators have noted, there are strong similarities to what happened in the USA 2 years ago. But beyond that, there is also a sense that since Jair Bolsonaro has not really conceded defeat to Lula, and his supporters had been camping outside the presidential palace for, the last 2 months, there was a very strong sense that a small minority of Bolsonaro supporters were not accepting the results and were trying by every means possible to overturn them.
Yeah. In fact, what is also interesting is that just a few hours ago, we've seen rallies in support of Lula da Silva. Here's this man who initially was being lauded for having some kind of spectacular political comeback from controversy, now being mired in this latest drama. I wonder whether it's too early, you might reckon, to place his status in the political landscape in Brazil on the back of the storming of these institutions.
Yeah, I think Lula has tried to mobilize his charisma to, set a very conciliatory tone since he won the elections. He's really tried to put forward the fact that he wanted to govern for all Brazilians. And so I think in that sense, he was taking stock of the fact that he had become a controversial person after his condemnation for corruption a few years ago. So he was really trying to go beyond that controversy to appear as a figure capable of, uniting the Brazilian people. That's his main challenge, right? Whether he will manage to do so is still unclear. He's clearly taken a firmer tone, saying that he will prosecute all the people who have led and are behind these attacks. Whether that will strengthen his legitimacy or provoke the contrary, it is too soon to tell.
Yeah. The current Minister of Justice in Brazil has slammed these protests or the assault as some kind of coup against the state. It's comments that are likely to inflame those protesters who ironically see themselves as patriots in that country. I wonder whether the approach that government has taken here, you reckon, will solve this issue as urgently as it needs to be solved.
It might solve the issue in terms of bringing a very strong, political and judicial response. But in the longer term, it remains difficult to know what the government will actually be capable of doing. Because if this attack has shown one thing, it is that these, fanatic supporters are organized. They are funded. So they clearly have support probably within the state apparatus itself, within the security forces themselves. So being able to actually investigate and call out the people responsible without it looking like a partidarian witch hunt is going to be very tricky indeed.
Sure. Are you saying that the state perhaps might be split about how to even respond to what's going on?
Yes, I believe that would be a correct assessment. Bolsonaro's defeat in the presidential election was a very narrow one, but he also had lots of victories at the governor level and in parliament, which shows that his movement and the people who support him and support his ideas have infiltrated, the Brazilian state and the administration. So yes, clearly, I do not think that all state officials are seeing, are having the same analysis of what is happening. So whether Lula's administration will manage to prevail and, get everyone in order is what we will be carefully looking at in the next days, weeks, and months.
Yeah. Interesting, when we speak about who or what might be behind these protests, Jair Bolsonaro has distanced himself from it. In fact, in a series of tweets, is in one way or the other calling for calm whilst he receives medical treatment in a different country. In fact, there are visuals of him in hospital. I wonder to what extent, though, he can be held accountable for what's taken place, given the rhetoric during his tenure and what he said post the results being announced in that country of the presidential election.
I mean, Jair Bolsonaro's very careful stance since he is defeated shows that he is worried about his future and he is worried about potential prosecution. So I think the fact that he is not openly supporting these actions and is not, and is calling for an end to violence doesn't necessarily mean that he actually disapproves it. The reason I say this is because, as you mentioned, for months before the elections, he has been the one saying that the vote would be rigged. He's been the one casting doubt on the transparency of the electoral process, and he was the one who said he would not concede defeat because he would never lose if this was a fair fight. So clearly, the fact that he is now taking his distance from his, most radical supporters is not very credible, considering how much he's sown in the last few months.
Yeah, I mean, speaking about that, and you've already done this, it's a bit difficult not to draw parallels between what's taken place in Brazil and what took place in the U.S. with the storming of the Capitol. In fact, these two events were just 2 days apart, also would have been exactly 2 years after the other, if you get what I mean. And as we, I guess, do this comparison, it's also difficult not to draw the similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump, these two seemingly populist presidents who have inflamed whatever kind of violence has unfolded in both countries. I wonder, as you observe this, whether you reckon there are serious lessons to be learned around what leadership looks like and what the consequences are.
Yes, I mean, you bring up many important points. In terms of the parallels between the attacks, I mean, the fact that there was a clear sort of influence and that, the attack against the Capitol in 2021 in the USA brought some sort of precedent is undisputed. Then there are also some more complicated influences. Steve Bannon has been mentioned repeatedly since yesterday as someone who, might have been pushing for this, encouraging this, and liaising with Bolsonaro's supporters to create that kind of precedent. So indeed, there are some parallels between the two countries. Another parallel between the two countries, and that's where I think we need to think about leadership, but we also need to think about the strong historical trends that are at play here in countries that are racially divided, extremely unequal, where there are lots of violence against minorities. Trump and Bolsonaro embody these kinds of conservative politics, from a white population that is extremely adverse to diversity and to the inclusion of certain groups in the political and economic arena.
Yeah, I mean, in that context where, there's so much diversity of opinion, do you reckon there's a way of profiling the type of person who would have actually stormed those institutions, specifically in Brazil? Or are you finding that it's a cross-section of people in that country who happen to resonate with this idea that the election may have been rigged? It's an interesting constellation of support that Bolsonaro has brought, and it has changed over time as well. When he first came into power, he was very much supported by the conservative fringe of Brazilian society, big business, etc. It shifted slightly because, his personal extravagance, his provocations were actually deemed very bad for Brazil's image abroad and for Brazilian business generally. So he's not as supported by these sectors. Where he has been very successful, however, is to reach out to more vulnerable, poorer, working class groups through evangelical networks who support very much Bolsonaro. His wife here has had a very big influence in mobilizing evangelical networks to, demonize Lula, demonize the Workers' Party, and present Bolsonaro as the savior of Brazil. So what we see is that although he clearly is defending the interests of the wealthy and the conservatives in Brazil, he has actually managed to touch a chord with poorer populations through this spiritual evangelical connection. It's interesting. In the U.S., we're seeing Trump, in some ways, people might say, facing the music because of what he said and the links to the riots or the attack on the Capitol. I wonder whether you reckon that kind of accountability is a reality in Brazil. I mean, do you see a situation where Jair Bolsonaro, for instance, will be called to some committee to account for his words, which may very well be linked to what actually unfolded?
Yes, I mean, and it's not the only topic on which he risks prosecution. If you think about the misinformation he spread about COVID and about vaccines,
right.
it had dire consequences on the Brazilian people. So whether he will be prosecuted is very hard to say. He's out of the country at the moment. I don't think that's a coincidence either. He is protecting himself from prosecution by staying abroad. The question is also, of course, there is separation of powers in Brazil, but the kind of unrest that prosecution of Jair Bolsonaro might create is also something that might be carefully taken into account in order to not stir further division and further political violence. So you see, it's a very tricky situation for the Brazilian authorities to know what to do with Jair Bolsonaro in the near future.
Yeah. This moment has also, I guess, brought into sharp focus the quality of leaders emerging from Brazil at this moment. We've already spoken about Lula da Silva's own controversies, which are in recent history, dare we add. I mean, as recently as 2020, 2021, there were court rulings in his favor or not, depending on how you see it. To what extent do you reckon people in Brazil are actually mulling over the question, over the kind of quality of their leaders, and ways through which how sometimes dysfunctionality at that level may have led to the chaos we've seen on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be an exaggerated personalization of power, isn't there? The fact that it was Lula who sort of had to come back to defeat Bolsonaro, as if, you know, there weren't other younger leaders in Brazilian politics capable of representing something else, is in itself a signal of, you know, the fragility of Brazilian democracy and of the contestation of political life, which, you know, started a decade ago with all the corruption scandals and the way they were weaponized by the political class. So there is clearly a very large discredit of politicians. To some extent, we could say that the Brazilians don't have the leaders they deserve. It appears in many democracies now that the role that social media are playing as well are, you know, being quite favorable to very provocative, demagogue politicians. So this is an issue that democracies have to reckon with. Brazil and the United States are very clear examples of this, but they're not the only ones.
Absolutely. Great lessons hopefully being learned across the country as we watch both these nations grapple with the future of their democracies in one way or the other. Dr. Dorothee Boulanger, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Dr. Boulanger is a research fellow with Oxford University.